Imagine standing in a corridor where silence is survival, where the rustle of silk against marble floors carries the weight of a death sentence, where a glance held too long, a whisper heard by the wrong ears, or a rumor born in jealousy can transform a woman from royal consort to mutilated warning in a single afternoon. This is not the battlefield of Thermopylae. This is not the naval disaster at Salamis. This is the interior world of the Achaemenid Persian court under Xerxes I, where the most dangerous enemy wasn't the Greek hoplite, but the rival sleeping in the chamber next door. Before we descend into that world, take a moment to let us know where you're joining from. Whether you're listening in Cairo, watching from Toronto, or commuting through São Paulo, drop your city in the comments. It's genuinely astonishing to see how many corners of the globe share this hunger to understand the darkest corridors of the past. And if you appreciate deep historical dives that go beyond the surface, hit that subscribe button. We're building a community that refuses to settle for Wikipedia summaries. The story you're about to hear involves punishment so calculated, so theatrically brutal, that ancient Greek historians recorded it with a mixture of horror and fascination. It involves a king who ruled 28 nations, commanded armies that drank rivers dry, and yet found his authority most threatened not by foreign rebellion, but by the private lives of the women confined within his own palace walls. What Xerxes did or allowed to be done wasn't merely vengeance. It was statecraft. It was a lesson inscribed in flesh, designed not for the victim, but for every observer who would carry the memory like a scar. By the end of this account, you will understand why royal women in the ancient world lived every day on the edge of annihilation, and why the term harem conceals a reality far more chilling than any Hollywood fantasy. The Achaemenid Empire, at its zenith, stretched from the Indus Valley to the coast of Libya, from the steppes north of the Black Sea to the cataracts of the Nile. Xerxes inherited this dominion in 486 BCE from his father, Darius the Great, along with a court system refined over generations to manage not just territory, but loyalty. Persian kingship was absolute in theory, but delicate in practice. The king's legitimacy rested on divine favor, yes, but also on his ability to maintain the intricate web of noble families, satraps and military commanders whose cooperation kept the empire from fragmenting. And nowhere was this balance more fragile than in the royal gyneconitis, the women's quarters. The Greek term harem entered European languages centuries later, borrowed from Arabic, but the institution itself was ancient and Persian. It was not a pleasure palace. It was a political institution, as carefully administered as any treasury or garrison. The women who lived there, daughters of Persian nobility, Median princesses, Babylonian aristocrats, women from Lydia, Bactria, Egypt, were hostages as much as they were wives. Their marriages sealed alliances. Their sons legitimized power. Their loyalty, or the appearance of it, stabilized the throne. Our sources for what happened inside these walls are fragmentary and biased. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century BCE, is our most detailed witness. But he was Greek, writing for a Greek audience eager to hear tales of Persian decadence and despotism. Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician at the Persian court, offers even more salacious accounts, many now dismissed as embellishment. Persian royal inscriptions, by contrast, are silent on domestic scandal. They speak only of victories, piety, and the divine mandate to rule. So we must read between traditions, recognizing that even if the most graphic details are exaggerated, the structural truth remains. In a system where women were political currency, scandal was sedition, and punishment was propaganda. The scale of the royal household defies easy comprehension. Xerxes' court at Persepolis and Susa wasn't a single building but a complex of palaces, administrative halls, treasuries, and residential quarters that housed thousands. The king maintained multiple wives, not out of mere appetite but as a deliberate strategy of incorporation. Each marriage bound a noble family to the throne. Each son born carried a potential claim, and with it a potential crisis. The royal women's quarters were therefore a universe unto themselves, governed by eunuch chamberlains, guarded by soldiers who had been ritually castrated to ensure no lineage could challenge the king's own, and surveilled by networks of servants whose reports could elevate or destroy. Access to this world was controlled with paranoid precision. No man who retained his fertility could enter without explicit royal permission. The women themselves were segregated by rank. Senior wives occupied chambers near the king's private apartments. Concubines and lesser wives lived further away, their proximity a barometer of favor. Daughters of the king, sisters, aunts, all moved through this space, their lives circumscribed by protocol. They could not leave without permission. They could not speak to outsiders. Their correspondence, if they were literate, was monitored. Their friendships were scrutinized for factional alignment. They could not look away from one another. That was the unbearable intimacy of it. In a world with no privacy, every gesture became a message, every relationship a potential conspiracy. If a woman laughed too loudly at a banquet, someone noted it. If she received a gift from the king, her rivals calculated its weight in gold and its weight in favor. If she bore a son, she became a target. If she remained childless, she became expendable. The psychological architecture of the harem was designed to turn women against one another, to ensure that loyalty flowed upward to the king and never laterally to each other. And into this pressure chamber, the Greeks tell us, came a scandal. The mechanics of how such a scandal could ignite are easier to trace than the scandal itself. Begin with the king. Xerxes, by all accounts, was a man of powerful appetite and mercurial temperament. He had inherited not just an empire, but also his father's expectation that Persian kings should embody grandeur in every aspect of life. Darius had taken multiple wives. Xerxes would do the same, but multiplicity breeds rivalry. According to Herodotus, Xerxes' principal wife was Amestris, daughter of Otanes, one of the 7 Persian nobles who had helped Darius seize the throne. Amestris was not decorative. She was politically astute, ruthless in defense of her son's succession rights, and feared even by the king. The protocols governing the king's attention were elaborate. When Xerxes desired a woman, protocols were observed. The eunuch chamberlain would be notified. The woman would be summoned, bathed, perfumed, dressed according to ritual prescription. She would be conducted to the king's chamber through passageways designed to prevent observation. Afterward she would return, and the encounter would be noted in records kept by the chief eunuch, records that tracked lineage should a pregnancy result. This wasn't romance. It was bureaucracy. But protocols are only as strong as the people who enforce them. And people, even in a despotism, have motives of their own. A eunuch might owe loyalty to a particular queen faction. A servant might sell information to a rival family. A guard might accept a bribe to ignore a midnight movement. The architecture of surveillance created a system where everyone watched everyone else, but it also created opportunities for those skilled in deception. Herodotus places the origin of the catastrophe in attraction. He claims that Xerxes became infatuated with his brother Macist's wife, a woman of notable beauty. Unable to seduce her directly, he arranged a marriage between his own son, Darius, and her daughter, Artainte. The logic was proximity. If the mother wouldn't yield, perhaps through the daughter he could maintain closeness to the family. But then, Herodotus claims, Xerxes' attention shifted to Artainte herself, his new daughter-in-law, and this time his advances were successful. The affair, conducted in secret, might have remained hidden, but Xerxes made a mistake. In a moment of passion or gratitude, he offered Artainte anything she desired. She asked for the robe he was wearing, a garment woven by Queen Amestris herself, a robe that was immediately recognizable. Xerxes tried to deflect, offering cities, gold, armies. Artainte insisted, and Xerxes, bound by a king's oath, gave it to her. When Amestris saw her own handiwork being worn by another woman, she knew, and knowing she did not weep, she calculated. The question Herodotus leaves unanswered is whether Amestris cared about sexual betrayal at all, or whether what she recognized was a political threat. Artainte was young, beautiful, fertile, and now visibly favored. If she bore Xerxes a son, that son would carry the bloodline of Macist's, a brother who commanded his own military forces. The factional mathematics were dangerous. So Amestris waited. She waited until the king's birthday, a festival called the Ticta, when by tradition the king could refuse no request from the queen, and then she asked for a gift. Not gold, not land. She asked for Macist's wife, Artainte's mother. Xerxes understood immediately what Amestris intended. He begged her to choose something else. He even offered Amestris his own daughter in exchange, a grotesque negotiation that reveals how thoroughly women were treated as transferable assets. But Amestris would not be moved. The request had been made publicly, before witnesses. To refuse would humiliate the queen and signal that the king feared her. So Xerxes, in one of the ancient world's most chilling acts of complicity, granted the request. What happened next was not execution, it was obliteration. Amestris had Macist's wife seized by her personal guards and taken to a private location within the palace complex. There, in a chamber where screams would not carry, the queen's agents conducted a punishment designed not to kill, but to erase identity itself. They cut off the woman's breasts. They cut off her nose, her ears, her lips, and her tongue. They fed these pieces to dogs while she watched. Then they sent her home. They could not look away, the servants who carried out the orders, the eunuchs who stood guard, the other women in the quarters who heard, through walls and whispers, what was happening. The guards who later escorted the mutilated woman back to her husband's house, her body now a message written in scar tissue. The immediate consequences spiraled outward, like cracks in ice. When Macist saw what had been done to his wife, he understood that his entire family was now marked for annihilation. He fled toward Bactria, his provincial stronghold, intending to raise a rebellion. Xerxes, recognizing the existential threat, dispatched a military force that intercepted Macist's on the road. They killed him, his sons, and his entire retinue. Artainte vanishes from the historical record at this point, her fate unrecorded but easily imagined. The robe, The piece of woven fabric that had triggered the catastrophe becomes in Herodotus' narrative a symbol of how the smallest breach of protocol in an absolute monarchy can escalate into familial annihilation. But the story's significance extends beyond one family's destruction. The punishment Amestris inflicted was not impulsive sadism. It was carefully calibrated political theater. By mutilating rather than killing, she ensured that the victim would live as a walking warning. Every woman in the royal quarters would see or hear about the consequences of being perceived as a rival. Every noble family with daughters in the palace would understand that proximity to the king offered no protection. If the queen deemed you a threat, the punishment was designed to generate narrative, to be told and retold, to colonize the imagination of every woman who might, in some future moment, consider accepting the king's advances. The psychological aftermath rippled through generations. Later Greek sources, particularly Ctesias, report additional instances of brutal punishment within Persian royal households. A concubine accused of poisoning, a princess suspected of conspiracy. Each story follows a similar pattern: accusation, no formal trial, punishment that serves as spectacle. The repetition suggests either that such events were common or that the original story became a template, a narrative that Greeks used to explain Persian court culture to themselves. One detail preserved in Ctesias hints at the administrative apparatus behind these punishments. He mentions a specific executioner, a eunuch named Artaxerxes, who specialized in what the Greeks called Persian discipline, a euphemism for ritualized mutilation. The fact that such a role was specialized, that it had a title and a practitioner, suggests that this wasn't anomalous brutality, but institutionalized procedure. The palace maintained a specialist in the destruction of bodies because the destruction of bodies was, occasionally, necessary to the maintenance of power. The archaeological record offers a strange corroboration. Excavations at Persepolis have uncovered administrative tablets, written in Elamite, that record rations distributed to palace personnel. Among the categories, guards of the women's quarters, eunuch supervisors, and a class of individuals identified only as disciplinary staff. We don't know what their duties entailed, but the category exists, budgeted and provisioned like any other branch of palace administration. They could not look away. Not the scribes recording the ration distributions, not the architects designing the separate entrances and soundproofed chambers, not the physicians who surely must have been summoned afterward to prevent infection, to ensure the mutilated victim survived long enough to serve as example. The deeper question, the one Herodotus gestures toward but doesn't fully articulate, is why this system persisted. Why did noble families continue to send their daughters into an institution where they might be elevated to queen or reduced to warning? The answer lies in the structure of imperial power itself. In the Achaemenid system, access to the king was access to everything: wealth, land, military command, tax exemptions, legal protections. A family with no connection to the royal household was a family in decline, vulnerable to rivals who did have connections. So despite the risks, despite the stories everyone knew, the daughters kept coming. The gamble was rational. The odds of catastrophe were small. The rewards for success were infinite. And the women themselves, did they internalize the logic of their confinement? Some surely did. Amestris, after all, was a woman navigating the same system. Her brutality wasn't male violence imposed on women. It was a woman wielding the only power the system permitted her, control over other women's bodies. This is the cruelest paradox of the harem structure. It positioned women as both victims and enforcers, ensuring that the violence required to maintain the system didn't always require male hands. One final archival fragment sheds light on the legacy of these events. A century after Xerxes, when Alexander the Great conquered Persia and entered the palace at Persepolis, his historians recorded finding sections of the royal quarters that had been abandoned and sealed. The Macedonian soldiers who broke the seals reported rooms that still smelled of perfume and decay, chambers where furniture remained arranged but covered in dust, as though the inhabitants had fled suddenly and never returned. Later Persian kings, it seems, had preserved portions of the old women's quarters as they were a museum of terror, a reminder to each new generation of royal women what descent might cost. The story of what Xerxes did or allowed to be done to the women of his household isn't just a tale of ancient cruelty. It's a window into the logic of absolute power, the way it transforms intimacy into strategy and love into liability. It reveals how systems of control don't require constant violence, only the credible threat of it, the memory of one punishment vivid enough to render 1,000 others unnecessary. The women of Xerxes' court lived every moment under the weight of that memory. They dressed with it. They spoke carefully around it. They loved, if they loved at all, in its shadow. The Greeks who recorded these stories wanted their audiences to see Persian court life as a moral failure, a cautionary tale about what happens when one man holds too much power. But the deeper horror is how familiar the structure remains. Strip away the details of robes and eunuchs and palaces, and what's left is a pattern that appears across centuries and cultures, a system that isolates women, pits them against each other, and then punishes them for the conflicts that isolation creates. The women couldn't look away from each other because they were trapped in a space designed to make surveillance inescapable. And we can't look away from their story because it asks a question that still hasn't been answered. When survival requires complicity in the suffering of others, when the only power available is the power to harm those even more vulnerable, what choice is really being offered? Xerxes died in 465 BCE, murdered in his bedchamber by the commander of his own guard. Amestris survived him, wielding power through her son's reign until her own death decades later. The mutilated woman, Macist's wife, disappears from history after being sent home, her name not even preserved. The robe, the object that set everything in motion, was probably destroyed, burned or buried to remove the stain of scandal. But the story survived. It survived because it captured something essential about power, that its most intimate expressions are often its most brutal, and that the architecture of palaces, no matter how beautiful, is always also the architecture of prisons,